Hi everyone, welcome to another 7-minute software video. Today we're going to kick off the 2D media section and look at vector and raster representation. Vector and raster representation are probably the most common forms of 2D representation in design software. They allow us to share images, logos, drawings, and a lot of other media. And so it's super important that you understand the main differences between the two. We're going to look at the main principles and techniques for using them. And then I'm going to make a series of follow-up videos diving into each of these individually specifically. I'm going to be using a vector software called Adobe Illustrator, and I'm going to be using a raster software called Adobe Photoshop. But please understand that there are also alternatives and open source and freely available versions of vector and raster software out there as well. One of the most important differences between vector and raster representation is resolution. And so we're going to start by looking at how they handle resolution differently. So let's say that I want to draw a circle. I want to make a representation of a circle. If I go into vector software, usually vector drawing software will have a shape drawing tool. So Illustrator has this ellipse tool that I can use, and I can draw a circle on the screen. Now, if I go into my raster software here, I could also draw a circle on the screen. There's also a shape tools here. So I'm going to draw a circle in raster format and a circle in vector format. When I say resolution, I'm referring to the amount of pixels on the screen. When you create a document in a vector software, usually you will be dealing in page sizes because vector representation is typically associated with printing. Raster representation is typically associated with showing images on a screen, but they can also be printed out. Both of these forms of representation can be used for both print and for screen-based media. When you create a document in a raster software, you're typically asked what the size of the image that you're producing is. You have to define the number of pixels that you're going to have on your canvas to work with. In a vector representation, you're typically dealing with page sizes. And so let's look at how these two handle resolution differently. If I go into my vector software and I zoom in to the circle that I've just drawn, you'll notice that the circle stays perfectly round no matter how far I zoom in. This line is perfectly smooth. I can zoom in a lot into the circle, and my line will always be perfectly smooth. I always get a clean edge. Now if I go and scale this, if I make it bigger, and I zoom into it, I still get a smooth line. If I shrink it, and I zoom into it, I still get that smooth line. And so this basically means that vector representations do not depend on resolution. I am not bounded by the amount of pixels on my screen because it adapts to the size of the screen. Now there's some math going on behind the scenes here, and we don't have to get into it, but just understand that vectors are kind of idealized shape representations. Now if you go into your raster software and we zoom into the same circle that we drew, something that you might notice is that after a while you start to see the individual pixels that make up the image. Because we've defined a limited number of pixels, there's only so much resolution that we can get, and there's a limit to how close I can get. And so raster representation is inherently limited. Now you might ask yourself, why would you want to use raster representation when vector representation is available? Well, that's because vector representation also has certain limits. For example, if I wanted to give some texture to this circle and make it look like it was being eroded by dust or something, I can use an eraser tool and I can start to erase part of the shape. But one thing that you'll notice is that the edges are still smooth. There's a kind of crispiness to the line that could be useful in some situations, but maybe not when you're trying to give a sense of texture. And so if I go into my raster representation here and I use a similar eraser tool and I zoom into it, I can start to erase the pixels. And you'll notice that depending on how hard the brush that I use is, you start to get a much more fine-grained control over the texture of the image. Now you can even change the brush in Photoshop to be even more textured, like this. And you'll notice that this starts to look much more like an eroded circle than this. And so it's important to be aware of these two distinctions relative to resolution. The other main difference between vector and raster representation is how much control you have over the shape or the image that you're working on. Now, vector representation is essentially made up of points and lines. And so this shape is defined by a series of points and lines. Sometimes the lines are arcs, sometimes they are complex curves. But essentially, if you look at the structure of a vector representation, it's really just a series of points and lines that are being connected. And you have control over how those points and lines are working together. With raster representation, on the other hand, I don't have access to that, but I do have access to all of the pixels in my image. And so in order to manipulate the pixels on an image, I probably have to do things like erase and add pixels or blend them in different ways. And so here I'm just using a shape marquee tool to select areas that I can crop out. Think of it as a grid where you can place a pixel of any color in any location on that grid. So if I just select my brush tool, for instance, and I pick a color, I'm placing pixels of different colors somewhere on this grid. And they're going to stay there unless I manipulate them by changing their color or erasing them altogether. Now, the last thing to keep in mind is outputs. So we've talked about how vector outputs can be scaled infinitely and about how raster outputs are dependent on a certain resolution. This correlates to the file formats that are available to you. Vector representation, you're most likely going to output to some format like a PDF or an SVG file, which stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. Or it could be a software-specific format like AI, which stands for Adobe Illustrator. In raster representation, the file formats are more common. Raster representation is the most common format for photography. And so you may already be familiar with a lot of raster representation formats like JPEG, PNG, TIFF. These file formats are typically compressed, and I have a video on compression if you want to learn more about that. So hopefully this has been a useful introduction to the main differences between vector and raster representation. In following videos, I'm going to go deeper into each of these forms of representation and show you some techniques for working with them. See you next time.